Paradigm Profiles is on the Nuestra Familias Insurrection. Some might say that the insurrection began at the break of Operation Black Widow on a morning in June of 2001 when the NF generals in Pelican Bay SHU were told to pack their property so they could be transferred out. But it actually began to develop earlier than that. It began to develop when Gerald Cuete Rubalcaba, who was then appointed to act as an interim general, put a green light on Daniel Lizard Hernandez to prevent him from exposing all the embezzling that Cuete was suspected of. Cuete decided that his best course of action would be to put all the blame on Lizard and then to have him hit so that the truth would forever be suppressed. To Lizard, this was the most disgraceful and worst form of betrayal imaginable. It was a betrayal that would weigh so heavily on him that it would make him look and question his own loyalty to the NF. I couldn't make myself come to terms with the fact that the NF, an organization that I had sacrificed everything in my life for, was capable of the type of deception and betrayal that was all being directed at me, said Lizard. And it was coming from one of the most respected leaders in the O, someone I looked up to and someone who I held respect and admiration for. I was discouraged to a degree that was beyond anything I had ever felt before. At first, I just felt discouraged and betrayed. But then that turned to anger and resentment, and it began to weigh so heavily on me that all I wanted to do then was to make sure that Cuete felt that same fucked up feeling that he made me feel. That's when I decided I was officially done with the mob, and that's when I knew I was going to cooperate, said Lizard. Before a Santa Rosa gang detective by the name of George Collard even knew that he was going to spearhead a massive investigation that would eventually morph into a 3-year, 30-agency, $5 million case codenamed Operation Black Widow, Lizard was being primed up and prepared to go out to the streets of Northern California to effectuate Cuete's agenda. Lizard at the time considered himself to be lucky to have moved right next door to Cuete and Pelican Bay SHU program. At the time, Cuete had just been appointed to fill one of the organization's top positions as a general, due to the position being temporarily vacated. The appointed general, Joseph Pinky Hernandez, had just been indicted by a Santa Clara County grand jury, and therefore his position was to be temporarily filled until he returned. This was according to NF law, and this would later become a critical example. Per NF law, whenever appointed NF leadership becomes incommunicado, is placed in a position that hinders him from performing his duties or gets transferred out as a result of facing legal endeavors, he is to relinquish his position until the conclusion of said circumstance has come to pass. Cuete was next in line in the organization's rungs of leadership positions, so he was delegated this position on an interim basis. Cuete, who was a lifer from Tulare County, a high-ranking NF member, and had earned his bones in Susanville after killing a suspected snitch. The murder took place on the level 2 yard in dorm 68 on 3/31/79 after Cuete and another individual named Pelon stabbed another inmate 34 times and left his body in a pool of blood. Both Cuete and Pelon were later convicted in 1981, but this incident helped Cuete elevate his status within the NF. Although Cuete had been deeply involved in the organization's affairs as the RSD, Regimental Security Department, prior to being appointed to take over the vacated general position, he didn't waste any time wielding his power. One of the first orders of business he orchestrated and planned was the impeachment and murder of Robert Brown Bob Viramontes. At the time, Brown Bob was one of the last remaining members of the OGB, organizational governing body, and was one of the highest ranking members within the organization. Word had just come back that Vincent Big Chente Arroyo from Chino had just defected and was cooperating in the San Jose indictments after learning he was faced with the death penalty. And Rafael Old Man Rafa Rubio from Fresno was ousted and hit after he was accused of treason. This left 2 seats vacated. Old Man Rafa engaged with the M in an attempt to agree on a peace formula and had actually enlisted the help of then Governor Pete Wilson and his advisors. Old Man Rafa had good intentions and had called his project La Chicanda, the Brown Crowd, However, the only problem with his plan was that he didn't consult with the other members of the OGB first and had already been in discussions with the MA before seeking approval. Brown Bob and other high-ranking NF members felt like old man Rafa had pursued this behind their backs and therefore had committed a high crime. Although Cuete was well within his right to sanction a hit on a high-ranking member like Bibi, it was still a ballsy move. Cuete and some of his closest confederates like Bibi had contributed to an internal rift within the organization that was known as the D Facility Dilemmas. One of the main instigators that caused this rift was his last cellmate, Art Big Smiley Ramirez from Salinas. After Bibi paroled, Big Smiley attempted to put some of his radical ideas into play, and this didn't sit well with other members of the organization. Only favored members held leadership positions and, as a rule, authority itself. Big Smiley, however, felt he could quickly seize an opening to be an instant leader of the unorganized. It was exactly their seeming hopelessness that attracted Big Smiley. He had a predilection for redeeming lost causes. Big Smiley always sought out situations in belief that he was all that was needed to turn the tide, and that he was the cutting edge that was needed. D Facility, however, would end up epitomizing those feelings. Big Smiley, who actually recruited me with Michael Castillo being my sponsor, became a tyrant and had aspirations that were completely selfish and self-absorbing. He wanted to create a position for himself called the boss of all bosses. This would have given him the same type of power as the entire OG body itself, and this was a title that he began floating around when Bibi was still his celly. Bibi probably just wrote him off as a J-Cat, someone who's crazy, but Bibi's mistake was not making his position clear one way or the other. He should have made his position clear by advising other high-ranking NF leaders that he was completely against Big Smiley's radical ideas. But because he didn't, it was assumed that he was on board and that he was in cahoots with his ex-cellmate. One of Big Smiley's biggest critics would be another high-ranking NF member from San Jose named Pablo Pantera Peña. Pantera wasn't impressed with Big Smiley's ideas and didn't hold no punches when it came to letting his position be known. He filed a complaint to Cuete and advised him that if Big Smiley was allowed to move forward with his ridiculous ideas, that he called for Bibi's impeachment and anyone else's who allowed it. Pantera went as far as saying that as long as he was part of the Familia, that he would never allow a seat to self-create a position like the boss of all bosses, and he asked Cuete to slow him down. But before Cuete could intervene or take any action, Big Smiley and Pantera perpetrated a small internal war that pitted a lot of C's and NR members from San Jose and Salinas against each other. It eventually got physical, where they began spearing each other, fighting in the cells, and it just created a lot of division in D Facility. Cuete tried to get them to stand down and even warned them several times, but these two were both stubborn old men, and it eventually led to both of them being expelled. Meanwhile, Cuete felt like Bibi was also abandoning his responsibilities to the O by failing to stay in contact, and that he was attempting to just fade out. There was also rumors that Bibi had covered up the NF tattoo on his back, and that he was also speaking at MAG conferences, Mothers Against Gangs. For these reasons, Cuete charged Bibi with treason for the D Facility rift, and then soon after began orchestrating his murder. Cuete wanted Bibi's murder to serve as a warning to the entire organization that nobody was above NF law, not even someone like Bibi, who was part of the organization's upper echelon. When Bibi's murder was being planned, I was housed in C2 with David Big Rock Ramirez from Salinas. Corny and Tex were housed in C3, but we had an open line of communication with them through the yard door. All the directives were coming from them and were then being passed to Daniel Stork Perez from Salinas and Sylvester Silver Gomez from Tulare County, who were also housed in C2 with me and Big Rock. Santos Bad Boy Bernius from Corcoran was also housed in C2 with us, but he was in another pod. At the time, I knew something was going on because of the amount of communication going back and forth between Bad Boy and Stork. Bad Boy paroled sometime in February of 1999, and I paroled a couple weeks after him in April of 1999. Within a week of paroling, I figured out why there was so much communication going back and forth to Bad Boy. They were preparing him and had sent him out with orders to participate in the killing of BB. I heard about it the following day after it happened on April 19th, 1999. Antonio Chukwugian from San Jose was assigned to oversee the murder and to ensure that it was carried out. Bad Boy and another NR member, Nuestra, named David Dreamer Escamilla from San Jose were appointed as the gunners. There was another individual named Albert Beto Avila, who I was in Susanville with, that offered to be the driver. On April 19, 1999, Chuco drove out to Campbell, California and sat down the street from a vantage point where he could see Brown Bob's house. As he was watching, he seen Beto pull the Ford Explorer up in front of Brown Bob's house. And then he watched as Bad Boy and Dreamer both exited the vehicle and walked up the driveway. Coincidentally, Brown Bob was standing outside in front of his house, washing his truck, who he called Lucille, when Bad Boy and Dreamer walked up and unloaded their bullets in him. Brown Bob tried to run in the garage, but they chased him and fatally wounded him in the driveway. Later, it was learned that Beto had failed to wipe down the Explorer and all of the fingerprints, and that he didn't burn it. Chuco would assume that this was what led to their arrest later, but this ended up not being true. In all actuality, Beto had nothing to do with their arrest, and it wouldn't have mattered if he would have wiped it down or not. Later, when the evidence was released, it was learned that they were arrested as a result of their own mistakes and that they were identified 20 minutes before the murder was even committed. Nonetheless, Beto was green-lighted and killed under assumption anyway. After Cuete had BB murdered, his next order of business was to implement a mandate that was known as El Norte Law. He drafted it up and then had copies sent out to all the street regiments, all the prisons, and all the Northerners in Pelican Bay Shoe. The basic gist of the mandate was an advisement to all the Northerners, the unaffiliated, non-structured street gang members, advising them that they were now going to be held to a higher standard and that this expectation wasn't open for debate. Cuete laid it out like this. He felt that since the Northerners come into our establishments, our households, in the prisons or in the county jails and reap the benefits, i.e. they're protected, they're embraced by the NF and the NR with care packages and whatever they need, that they should be required to function on the streets and generate money for our people. He went on to point out that they were cutting rap albums about the Norte and were profiting monetarily from it, that they were flagging our colors and using our name, so hence, they should all be required to step up and contribute the same way NR and NF members were contributing. He said, why should we be the only ones putting our freedom at risk? Why should we be the only ones spilling our sweat and blood for this struggle? What it basically was a power grab, and that's exactly how a lot of Northerners perceived it. They felt like they were being strong-armed and forced to function in the street regiments when this wasn't what they had signed up for. A lot of Northerners began dropping out and walking away. They had no interest in getting involved in these types of politics, and then it backfired. Nonetheless, even against the advice of other NF leaders, Cuete still implemented this advisement and continued to enforce it. Now that everything had pretty much played out and all these events had taken place, everything was pretty much set. Now that everything had pretty much played out and all these events had taken place, everything was pretty much set up for Lizard and Operation Black Widow to weave its intricate web. George Collard, the gang detective out of Santa Rosa, began his investigation by looking closer at the reasons why Miguel Maquillo Castillo was murdered and who exactly was involved. Even though he was assigned to Sonoma County and had his hands full with some of the cases that were developing out there, he began to look at Rico Smiley Garcia and Cesar Lobo Ramirez out in Salinas and why they had killed Maquillo. At that time, all he had was some of the same information that some of the homicide detectives had worked up in the case, but they really didn't have any witnesses or any heavyweight cooperators that could tie everything together. As he understood it, Maquillo's murder was an NF-sanctioned murder that took place on August 15, 1998. The details were still emerging, but the detectives were trying to find someone high up in the organization that was in the know and who'd be willing to play ball with them. Another murder that was connected to the case was the murder of Salvador Littleman Castaneda that took place in Castroville in an artichoke field on March 7, 1997. This was also another NF-sanctioned murder, and Littleman was not only an NF member, but he was also a close associate of Mike Eels. Collard had the basics and he knew who was involved, but he was lacking the correlations and all the links that would help him spin the Black Widow's web altogether. They had to find someone that they could either slap a case on or someone who was already facing charges and see if they could press him into rolling. And then it happened. Out of nowhere, Collard got a gift from God himself. It was literally hand-delivered and fell right into his lap. An SSU agent with CDCR called him and told him that he had a guy who was coming up for parole and who might be willing to talk to him and that he might have some information that would help his investigation. Collard was more than happy to meet with this guy, but he still had no idea how much he knew and how big this really was. When this individual was brought down to George Collard's office in Sonoma County, Collard had already prepared hundreds of pictures, reports, memorandums, and other evidence that might be helpful when debriefing this guy. He had even posted up a leadership chart that had an apex and pictures of all the leaders who were housed in Pelican Bay. When this individual was finally transported to Collard's office, one of the first things Collard did was to show him the leadership chart, and then Collard asked him to show him where he fit at on the chart. Collard watched him as he pulled the pin out that affixed his picture to the court board chart and couldn't believe what happened next. The individual pinned his picture at the very top of the apex. Daniel Lizard Hernandez identified himself as the leader who was assigned to oversee all the Northern California street regiments. For the next several hours, Lizard explained his reasoning for wanting to cooperate. He explained how he had been betrayed and deceived by Cuete, and he laid out everything he knew. This was the break Collard needed to wipe out the NF's leadership, and Lizard was the perfect guy to help him spin up Operation Black Widow. From this point on, Lizard was brought in as an operative for George Collard in the FBI. Now, be advised that Lizard's footsteps and all of his activities will be highlighted later in a future profile that Paradigm Media News will run. But for purposes of explaining the details of this NF insurrection, all the aforementioned information had to be shared. From this point on, Lizard would get tangled up in the Raymond Sanchez homicide, and he would continue as an operative until he was eventually pulled. But now this takes us to the point of Operation Black Widow, and when the power struggle was just beginning to develop between what will now be referred to as the federal and state factions. So once Operation Black Widow broke and the 7 principal figures were moved from Pelican Bay to Santa Rita, this is when the bad blood really started. If you remember at the beginning of the profile when Pinky was indicted by a grand jury out of Santa Clara County, he followed NF protocol by relinquishing his position as a general and passing it on to Cuete to hold on an interim basis. When the 7 principal figures that included Joseph Pinky Hernandez, Sheldon Skip Villanueva, Daniel Stork Perez, Gerald Cuete Rubalcaba, Tex Marin Hernandez, Cornelius Corny Tristan, and James Tibbs Morado were moved to Santa Rita because they had been indicted by a federal grand jury, they should have all relinquished their positions as Pinky had previously done. There was already reserves set up in the event a scenario like this had ever played out, and they knew this. Some of them actually helped draft up this specific policy that outlined this, but the bottom line is this. It didn't benefit them, and this would have been counterproductive to the agenda that they were now all pushing. Collectively, they decided that they weren't going to relinquish none of their positions, and they attempted to justify this or premise this under the reasoning that they would have been better suited to control and coordinate the streets from Santa Rita than they would have been able to do. This incensed a lot of the C's that were left behind in Pelican Bay, and they began scrambling to reorganize themselves. There were just too many unanswered questions for them to just sit around and wait for direction. Who was the appointed COC? Who was in control of the street regiments? Where were all the deposits going to be sent to? Who was controlling the money? Who had the money? Etc., etc. James Conejo Perez from Sacramento was one of the first C's in the Bay to speak up and ask for clarity. He was just trying to get the Bay reorganized since they left everything in disarray, but this was taken as if he was posing a resistance, and he was immediately stripped and advised that he was not to involve himself in any more of the street affairs. During the 3 years that the former leadership was housed in the Glendyre Federal Detention Facility in Oakland, they continued to control all the street regiments and basically kept all the C's in the Bay out of the loop. This just created more animosity, and the tensions only grew deeper. Meanwhile, Oscar Baby Joker Cabrera from Watsonville was finishing up his murder trial and was getting ready for sentencing. He needed to hurry up and get through his sentencing so he could get to prison. He had been in constant contact with NF leaders in ADX, and now he was anxious to hit a main line so he could see who was advocating for separation between the state and federal branches. Baby Joker was well aware of the rift that had been developing between the Bay and the former leadership, who had been indicted in the Operation Black Widow investigation. And although he understood that NF law was clearly on the side of the brothers in the Bay, Baby Joker stood squarely behind the federal faction. Another longtime NF member who also understood this, but who was also squarely behind the federal faction, was Mateo Rocha from Salinas. Both of these C's had a lot of influence amongst a lot of the NR Norteño street gang members. Mateo had a lot more influence within the NF and had a lot more experience, but BJ was an up-and-coming and had rightfully proven his loyalty to the NF. By this time, the rift between the state and federal factions had reached some common consensus, and both factions agreed that they would operate exclusively within the two systems. The state branch would focus on all the street regiments in California and agreed to allow anyone paroling to California on federal parole to function in their own crew indiscriminately. However, they made it clear that they wanted absolute separation. The federal branch agreed to this, and although they didn't address it, this didn't sit well with them. But for now, they agreed, and they also agreed to function exclusively within the federal system and other states they were breaking ground in. Sheldon Skip Villanueva, Joseph Pinky Hernandez, and Cornelius Corny Tristan were the ones who were credited with establishing NF regiments all over the country. But these three were also the most active when it came to dealing with California. Although on the face, Corny, Skip, and Pinky kept things civil and gave the state faction no reason to be concerned about the relationship between the two factions, they were growing tired of hearing about some of the mandates that California continued to facilitate about them. Furthermore, the fact that California leaders continued their 3-year-long probe and ongoing investigation with regard to the money that they were being accused of stealing just wasn't sitting right with them. With regards to the money that's being referred to is the money that's kept safeguarded in the organizational bank. All the money that was and is derived from all the street regiments and all the illegal activity generated from the streets. You can get an idea about how much money is generated by understanding how it works. So you have regiments that are established in most of all the major cities in Northern and Central California: Salinas, Sacramento, Santa Rosa, San Francisco, Visalia, etc., etc. All these regiments are contributing a monthly quota to the main organizational bank. The amounts being contributed depends on the size, the amount of manpower, and the success of each individual regiment. But it usually fluctuates somewhere in the area between 5K and 10K. Off the top, 25% of all illegal activities gets contributed to the main bank, along with monthly commissions. Monthly commissions is $200 flat rate that each member of the regiment is required to pay. So if you have 10 members functioning in that regiment, that's $2K just in monthly commissions alone. Plus the monthly quota from the illegal activities. Accumulatively, that can add up to tens of thousands of dollars. In 1999, my old cellmate, Big Rock from Salinas, was the one who was responsible for safeguarding this money and for making sure that it was being maintained in an account. When I paroled in 1999, I paroled to Mendocino County and was living in a small city called Ukiah. I got a phone call from an NF member named Louis Big Roach Oroche from San Francisco. This was a close homeboy of mine who was from my neighborhood. The last time I seen him was when we were cellies in C5 in Pelican Bay Shoe. Rose told me that he needed to see me ASAP and asked if I could get Robert Chico Rose to come out there for an emergency meeting. The following day, they both showed up at my house, and as soon as Big Roach got there, he handed me a manila envelope full of kites that he told me Cornell from Sacramento wanted me to read. Then he told me to stop all contact with Big Rock, that he was cooperating. Apparently, he was communicating with the FBI through the mail. He was exposed when one of his letters was returned to sender, and incidentally went to an Emmett member who had the same name by mistake. When he got the letter, he forwarded it to Stort, and that's how they found out. When Big Rock defected, he took the whole organizational bank with him. I believe that this is what motivated those who were indicted in the Black Widow case to hold their positions and why they scrambled to restock their coffers before giving up those positions. Big Rock is now being hidden in the federal WITSEC program. He can't even be found on Inmate Locator. Later, I'd find out that my homeboy Big Roach was cooperating and that he was wearing a wire when he came out there to see me and Chico. Trust me, there is no NF activity in Ukiah. It's a small rural town, and when I was living out there, I was the only NF member in that city. When I seen this article that's inserted on the screen below in one of the newspapers, I knew that this was a reference to that meeting that we had out there. Anyways, as I said, the federal branch didn't like the fact that some of the state leaders were still continuing to investigate where the missing money was, or if the federal branch was responsible for it. In fact, Corny and Pinky had launched an investigation of their own. They began getting reports that David D.C. Cervantes and James Cornejo Perez were both using heroin. Since they were both out on the main lines now and were no longer in the shoe, this was something they definitely felt warranted taking a closer look at. After a more thorough investigation, there was some level of cooperation after D.C. Celly Parole strung out on heroin. This youngster didn't have a history of using heroin. After living in a cell with D.C., he paroled with a bad habit. Apparently, this was confirmed by their ears and eyes out there, Mateo, who still remained loyal to them. One of the strongest links is through Larry Paki Amaro, who is now in ADX with Skip, Pinky, Corny, and Tibbs. Paki is with Mateo's sister, and those two have always been real close. So this is when things started to heat up. After BJ was sentenced, he ended up going through Wasco and then got transferred to Pleasant Valley, where Mateo, DC, and some of the other C's were at. They were all out there functioning together, and there was no animosity between any of them, but there was a noticeable division amongst them. Then word apparently got back to DC and Cornell that Mateo was assembling a crew to have them both hit, and that this was being orchestrated with the blessings of the federal branch. This was obviously an alarming situation, and it was an unfortunate development as Mateo was part of the general council. But DC and Cornell couldn't afford to take any chances and thus put a green light on Mateo. They sent 2 NR torpedoes to hit him, but when they put their plan in motion, BJ, Duck Moran from San Francisco, and some other ends all came to Mateo's defense. I'm gonna keep it real. I'm sure that the state faction can and will hold its own, but when it comes to the two, the federal faction is way stronger. It's not even a comparison. They're two entirely different factions, and the federal faction is a lot stronger. Right now, things are quiet. There's a huge elephant in the room that the state faction doesn't seem to be in a hurry to acknowledge. The federal leadership has aspirations to unite and come together under one leadership. They not only feel like they're capable of overseeing California, but they also feel a sense of entitlement to run California along with all the other states that are now under its control. They feel like this will not only make them stronger, but uniting under one banner follows the very concepts and ideals of what La Nuestra Familia was supposed to have always stood for, unity and carnalismo. It's going to be interesting to see what happens from this point on. The federal faction obviously has strong ambitions about uniting the organization, and I'm sure they would rather do it with DC, Cornejo, Chuco, and some of the other leaders all being on board with it. But as they've already demonstrated, they don't have a problem sending even some of its best into early retirement. if that's what it's going to take. And out of all people, these guys who have often done it themselves should know all too well that expendability in this game is an NF proclivity. It's just business as usual. They all know that the NF has never had any qualms when it comes to eating one of their own or getting rid of those who create obstacles. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Paradigm Profiles. We've got more good stories lined up for you guys, so we hope you guys will continue to stick with us and watch us grow. Thanks to you guys, the viewers. We just hit our 10,000 milestone, so we're getting ready to start dropping our merch. Also, if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the comment section so I can run another Q&A.